Good afternoon, welcome to the Conversations program. If you're just joining us, my name is Colleen Milliard. I'm at Basel's executive editor, and I'm delighted to be here to introduce a panel called Tokyo Inside Out, New Reading of Japanese Art in a Global Context, that we've put together in collaboration with our friends at Art Week Tokyo. On stage, we're thrilled to welcome Adam Szymczyk, the Curator-at at Kunsthaus Zurich, Doryun Chong, who is a longtime friend of Art Basel and artistic director and chief curator at M+ in Hong Kong. And of course, Andrew Maerkle, who will be moderating the conversation and is the editorial director of Art Week Tokyo. Please join me in giving Adam, Doryun, and Andrew a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Colleen, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's great to see such a great turnout here today. I'm Andrew Maerkle, Editorial Director of Art Week Tokyo. Today's talk is organized as a collaboration between Art Basel and Art Week Tokyo, and it is an immense pleasure and privilege for me to share the stage with our two speakers. Adam Szymczyk is going to be is curating the AWT Focus exhibition at Art Week Tokyo this year, addressing the theme, What is Real? The exhibition will be held at the Okura Museum of Art in Tokyo, and will feature about 50 to 60 artists from Japan and elsewhere. And Doryun is the curatorial director for a new a landmark survey exhibition, Prism of the Real, Making Art in Japan, 1989 to 2010, which is being organized as a collaboration between M+ and the National Art Center, Tokyo. So these are two really exciting exhibitions that will be on view during Art Week Tokyo in November. And the idea of today's talk is to maybe preview the exhibitions a bit, while also thinking about broader issues informing art making and exhibition making today. I think to set the stage, I would just note that you know, a lot of the discourse of Japanese modern and contemporary art has been shaped by the idea of a national culture and identifying national characteristics. At the same time, Japan really has a history of transnational exchanges going back to the late Meiji era, when the American art historian Ernest Fenollosa and the Japanese educator and curator Okura Tenshin, who went on to spend many years at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, formulated the new discipline of Nihonga, or Japanese painting, in response to the Western art forms that were then entering the country. So we can see how this articulation of Japaneseness is, in fact, as modern or more modern than the so-called attempts at modernization or westernization that were then taking place. So I think that's not to say that notions of national culture or nation-based exhibitions are not you know, useful. I think they can be a very good mechanism for introducing new forms of art practice to broader audiences, and we can think back in recent history to the many exhibitions of Chinese contemporary art that took place in the early 2000s as really introducing a new wave of artists who have gone on to establish themselves beyond the Chinese framework. But I think nation-based exhibitions can also obscure as much as they reveal. So, you know, I think especially at this time when we are being reminded of how national borders are sort of violently being reinforced, it's a good time for thinking about different ways of approaching place in contemporary art and thinking about how we can be attuned to place without essentializing place. So on that note, I'd just like to you know, throw the question out to our speakers, and maybe starting with Adam, what are some of the things that you've been looking at as you prepare the AWT Focus exhibition, and what are some of the ideas that you have for bringing something to Japan through the exhibition?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for this invitation to speak about the exhibition, which is still very much in the making, as we are still about to maybe close the list of artworks in the show, of which you see a work by Yuki Yama, a still from We Walk and Talk in Search of Home. And this We Walk and Talk in Search of Home is maybe a good phrase to begin with, so where this home is. And here you see the screen is sort of seen from two cameras of two persons who are walking the street. So they have this pedestrian experience of walking the street together, and then they kind of look at different things, but they're kind of in the same place, but looking at slightly different angles and slightly different buildings and the lights. It's late evening. They are walking and having this sort of intimate conversation in a video that is maybe like 20 minutes long or so. So I thought this parallax, or superimposition of views by two persons looking at the same place that is kind of familiar to them, but since many years passed since they walked together through this neighborhood, they may be talking about their memories. This could be a good, not a metaphor, but like a good image with which to begin thinking about possible views on the Japanese art scene, if such thing exists, or how to contextualize the artistic production in Japan today, younger artists, and also perhaps going as far back as to beginning of Japanese avant-garde in the 1920s, of which we'll also show some very notable examples in one exhibition, which is in the context of Art Week Tokyo. That is a great occasion to get to know Tokyo as far as contemporary art and modern art is concerned. And this exhibition is made of, in the first step, applications that are done by galleries that are present in Tokyo, and then the invited curator, in this case I, can choose from those works that the galleries applied with, or ask for different works, or ask for altogether different works from other galleries and so forth. So it's a kind of like beginning with a frame that is given, but then kind of trying to expand and slowly explode this frame and create something that's more organic as an exhibition format. So just to maybe I stop here, and we could continue.
Yeah, but I mean, I think in talking with you about the exhibition, you've also discussed looking at the Okura Museum of Art itself as another artwork in the exhibition, or as another element in the exhibition. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. As you see on this picture, this is the Okura Art Museum today, and it's been there since 1927 in the current building that was preceded by large kind of ensemble of buildings in the gardens of that family that in the end built a museum in 1927. It's interesting because the context has changed massively over the last 100 years. So just to show you, this is the building for those who haven't been there. It's 1927, but the building is a kind of mix or melange of different the elements borrowed from architectures of China, also India, and some other, sort of brought together into kind of hybrid building to host the first museum that was dedicated, in fact, to ancient art, and several items or objects that the museum owns are on the list of like national treasures in Japan. So it's a small but well, not so small, but like small museum, very notable collection of ancient art. And for this 1 week, the 2 floors of the museums are emptied practically, except for some very large sculptures that you might, yes, this is the entrance with a Buddha statue, not so much a Buddhist statue, but Chinese, welcoming the visitors, so to say. So kind of like, you know, the statue is now welcoming visitors to the museum, which is interesting. And so this is unmovable. We have to kind of work around and create special architectures in the museum to. This has some glimpses into previous exhibitions. There were 2 exhibitions here on previous editions of Art Week Tokyo, one curated by Kenjiro of Osaka and another one curated by Mami Kataoka last year. So as you see, there's a kind of like inbuilt architecture in this historicist structure of the 1927 museum and some artworks. Well, this is the view of the gardens before the Okura Museum was built in 1927. It was built following the Great Kanto earthquake that took place in 1923 and destroyed this beautiful palatial sort of garden ensemble with its wonderful galleries that were not at all, you know, white. They were rather elaborately designed to emulate, you know, the kind of tradition of handicrafts and the kind of interior of perhaps a house rather than a museum in the Western understanding of the word. The founder of the museum, Okura Kihachiro, who was coming from a you know, important industrialist like business family, and being a very cultivated person, he decided to gradually open his holdings or collection to general public, which after the Kanto earthquake, 1923, the museum opened 1927, and then it kind of opened to the general public. So it became like what is the museum today, really. And this is the results of destruction of these beautiful gardens during the Kanto earthquake, 1923. So it looked dreadful, and there is something like prophetic and something very universal about this image when you look at that. Like, destruction is really terrible, but it gave the impulse to the city to, you know, to show the resilience and to kind of rebuild it in a very different way. This is a painting by Katsura Mochizuki, who was a very important artist who kind of created a circle of anarchist avant-garde artists in Japan around 1920. In the wake of Kanto earthquake, he did several very small realist paintings showing the desolation that he encountered then following the earthquake. So we are very much hoping to include some of his work in the show. And there is his exhibition in a very beautiful museum outside of Tokyo called the Maerkle Museum that is dedicated to the so-called Hiroshima panels created in the 50s and early 1960s. So you're very encouraged to visit that museum, the Maerkle Museum too. It's absolutely unique. And they had an exhibition of Katsura Mochizuki that I happened to see in April. Therefore, I thought to bring this kind of early realist work into the show. And this is a statue of a Bodhidharma, which is located at the moment in the loggia on the first floor of the museum, on the upper floor of the museum. And as you see, it has this sort of fractured surface. So this is one of the works that suffered in the 1923 earthquake. So the museum could then show its primary function of not only keeping the object, but also, restoring and repairing, in fact, the objects and protecting them in a way. Apart from, of course, those that were irretrievably lost in the earthquake. And these are the first elevations and floor plans of the museum by architect Chuta Ito, who, as I said before, chose to be inspired by, well, he didn't choose to be inspired, but he was insisting on the importance of the local building traditions in a larger region, including also, as I said, Indian and Chinese architecture. And therefore, his project in 1927 was kind of immune to, the then nascent modern movement in, say, Europe, or as we believe to think globally. So there is another way of building and making things that was kind of really functional in the context where this museum was built. And on the in the right top corner of the drawing, you see what seems to be a kind of garden folly or kind of artificial ruin, but this is the actual ruin of buildings destroyed in that earthquake of 1923. After the earthquake and the period of prosperity of the museum, there were, among other things, following, the period, the imperial period in Japan of 1930s and the Second World War. Then there were the Tokyo Olympics, and for the Tokyo Olympics in the 60s, this hotel was built, which was the first Okura hotel, and you see the museum is just in the vicinity of that building that is very new at that time. That was then replaced by the present hotel, and there was a moment when the museum was literally moved 60 meters away from the hotel and kind of got closer to what is, I think, the residency of American Embassy. So this physical move of the museum to me was a sort of metaphor of precarity of position of culture and art within a kind of dynamically changing urban context dictated by larger historical process and, of course, the development of capitalism, basically, that is sort of raging around that museum, as we saw on the second picture with all the high rises and shiny surfaces. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Doryun, your exhibition is opening in September, on September 3rd, actually, in advance of Art Week Tokyo. So I think you're quite far along in the planning of the exhibition. But I'd like, I'm very curious about the title or the subtitle, Making Art in Japan, 1989 to 2010. That's a very distinct inflection from Japanese contemporary art, 1989 to 2010, or contemporary Japanese art. So I wonder if you could talk about, how you're approaching the exhibition and rethinking what it means to make art in Japan.
Yeah. So just to give a little bit of context of how the exhibition came about, so myself representing M+ in Hong Kong, a new kind of an institution that looks at contemporary visual culture globally, but really broadly across Asia and transnationally. And we built a new collection and curatorial programs that we began to show to the public just 3.5 years ago when we opened in November 2021. And Japan plays a very important role in our transnational and cross-regional collection. And you touched upon in your introduction the sort of the beginning of modernization in general, but in art education and art history already began in the late 19th century with seminal figures like Ernest Fenollosa or Okura Tenshin. It's also interesting to see Adam's sort of archaeology of the site of Okura Museum and the hotel, which I can also touch upon a little bit. So the reason why Japan plays such an important role in our institution, but in fact, I think we can say across Asia in all art histories, all national art history, is because it has a very long history of modernism that goes back to already 1870s, 1880s. So with that in the background, and I think National Art Center in Tokyo, as one of the national institutions focusing on modern and contemporary art, felt that it is really high time to have non-Japanese perspectives on its own art history. So working with the two curators, one from M+ and another from art center, we were really thinking about what is the time period that we want to really think about. The brief was given to us that it should be a historical survey, but other than that, there were no other expectations. And through discussion, we felt that this period of 1989 to 2010 is very, very important. When you look back on the history of Japanese modernization going back to 1868 or so, right? I think there are very important historical markers, many of them actually markers of catastrophes, right? Adam was talking about the great earthquake that hit the Kanto region surrounding Tokyo in 1923, and that shifts the sort of the direction of modernity. And more closer to our history, 1989 is undeniably a very important marker. I mean, that's global, of course, because of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. But what is really important, especially in Japan, is that in January that year, 1989, the imperial era of the Showa period under Emperor Hirohito, who of course was the emperor during the World War II, dies, and the next imperial era starts. So that is a major shift in Japan. And then we thought that, of course, the period of the 1990s and 2000s, straddling the turn of the new millennium, is an interesting period. But also this period is often spoken about, especially within Japan, as a so-called lost decades, right? That Japan went through in the mid-80s to early 1990s what was called so-called bubble economy that was really built on a lot of real estate speculation. This is when Sony was buying up, Hollywood companies and all of that. And then a lot of the Impressionist paintings were being bought by corporate collections, and this good time suddenly comes to an end at the beginning of the 1990s, and since then it is described as lost decades. And then we decided to stop in 2018 because many people may remember that in March 2011, then there was a great earthquake, another earthquake in the northern part of Japan with the tsunami that killed hundreds of thousands of people. So that is another traumatic event that really shifts the mood politically and socially and culturally. So we decided to look at these 2 decades with these 2 monumental temporal markers. But of course, that's the kind of big picture. But we also wanted to tell the story of what are the certain shifts that do happen within contemporary art in Japan itself. And it becomes really interestingly around circa 1989 to 1991. Then there's a whole generation of artists who came up that have been described in various ways. They're post-pop, post-conceptual. But then when you look at all of these figures, many of them are, of course, very, very well known, like whether it's Takashi Murakami with the image in the middle that you see, not like the Murakami that you see now, but early conceptual work, and Yasumasa Morimura, there's a performative conceptual photographer, and Yoshitomo Nara, of course, a very, very well-known figure. So all of these figures emerge right on the cusp of 1989, 1990, but they all have very distinctive styles. So you can't really categorize them under one other than the fact that there seems to be a critical turn that announces that contemporary art is entering into a new phase. The reason, to your question as to why do we decide to call in the subtitle Making Art in Japan 1989 to 2010 instead of Japanese contemporary art, and then that's in part answered by what you said of the problematics of the label, national label. There is no such thing as one national style or discourse, right? And it was also important in this project that we include artists who are not Japanese. So the Japanese contemporary art means that it is some kind of a monolithic entity or identity, but in fact, during these 2 decades that are often described as lost decades, in fact, there was a lot of porosity between the field and discourse within Japan and outside. Many Japanese artists were going outside, many international events were happening. In fact, a whole spate of contemporary art museums opened with international programs. Japan continues to exert a lot of fascination and influence on artists from outside. So many artists are making works inspired by Japan or Japanese culture. So that was another important point that we wanted to make in the exhibition. But as an exhibition, we wanted to, give some kind of a thematic section. Clearly, history is an obsession for a lot of Japanese artists or those artists who are interested in Japan, and history as in the catastrophe of World War II, ending with the bombings, atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then that trauma continues to really erupt again and again through the 90s and 2000s. But also what's called in Japan third wave of feminism, and really confrontation of gender stereotypes and dynamics are very much on the forefront of a lot of art making. And here on this slide, you see the example of Korean artist Lee Bull, who did this incredible 12-day performance between Korea and Japan. And the three images on the right by artists, well-known names here, Philip Areno, Dominic Gonzalez Forster, Pierre Week, who did this quite remarkable project around a character called An Lee, which was a generic manga or anime character that you can buy off a catalog, basically. And then so they bought this character and then animates it with a soul, right? So it actually injects ghost into the soul, and then it created a whole group of works. So a great example of how what was then seen as this futuristic culture coming out of Japan was very inspirational for some of these leading international artists. But towards the later part of the 2000s, it became much less about strong images or objects making, but artists really thinking about ways in which they can create alternative forms of community. So these are the three major ideas of history and identity and community that we are trying to think of as a prism of understanding, what kind of art was being made by the Japanese and non-Japanese artists in and around Japan is really what this exhibition is trying to do.
Right. And this is not your first major survey of Japanese art. When you were at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, you also curated an exhibition called Tokyo 1955 to 1970, A New Avant-Garde.
Yeah.
And even there, rather than using a kind of a framework of Japanese art, you zeroed in on a specific locus or city, Tokyo. Why, what were you responding to at that time?
Well, what was really fascinating at the beginning of research for this exhibition, so right around 2009, 2010, is to look into the collection and the archives of MoMA and realizing how much more international its program and outlook was in the 50s and 60s, in the earlier post-war years. And by, 80s, 90s, or 2000s, you certainly couldn't imagine MoMA as that kind of an institution. It was such a Western-centric institution, but the desire and then effort to diversify or globalize was very, very present, which I think was why I was on the staff. I and other colleagues were on staff at MoMA. And then looking at the history, there were actually a number of exhibitions focusing on Japan from late 1950s, 60s into the 70s. For instance, there was a big show called New Japanese Painting and Sculpture that opened at MoMA in 1965 and toured to, I think, 9 different venues across North America for 2 years. So this exhibition was basically organized right on the heels of the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. And many contemporary works from Japan at the time entered MoMA as part of that exhibition. But since then, it didn't see the light of day. It was languishing in the collection. So it really started out from archaeology of the institution's own internationalism that somehow went underwater in the subsequent decades. So based on that, so the exhibition actually included many, many works that were already in the MoMA collection, perhaps even 30–40% of them with great loans from many Japanese public collections. But I really decided to focus on that particular time period and Tokyo. I mean, Tokyo was not the only artistic epicenters, but it was the main one. And the period of 55, which is a decade after the end of World War II, and 1970 is often also seen as a great turning point because 64 was the Tokyo Olympics and 70 is Osaka Expo. There's currently an Osaka Expo again going on, but these two events were seen as finally Japan has risen again like a phoenix from the ashes, right? That the post-war devastation is over. By 1968, Japan is the second largest economy in the world. So so many things happened in this very compressed 15-year period, which is why I wanted to emphasize that time period, and just the energy was clearly incredibly dynamic. Yeah, that's what that exhibition was about.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing your exhibition did was to show how Tokyo was also, it was never static. There were people coming from different regions of Japan into Tokyo. International artists come to Tokyo, Japanese artists going out from Tokyo.
Yeah.
And Adam, you know, aside from looking at Okura Museum of Art as a place, you've also done a number of projects where you kind of try to shift notions of place with regard to cities. You know, obviously your Documenta 14, bringing Documenta out of Kassel into Athens, or displacing Documenta in a sense, was a major undertaking. So, I mean, what are your reflections on that approach to the place of an exhibition, and what was the necessity also for doing that?
Well, I think it's not an interest in history of a place per se, but it's more like a wish to connect the contemporary production art to larger social, political, economic context of the place, and maybe the museum is the locus, which can be like analyzed and dissected in its kind of historical development and its present condition to begin with. So it's more like a sense of touching the ground first. But this exhibition that I propose is called What is Real, so I decided not to go into any larger abstract categories, but more to ask a question that I think concerns all of us, like globally and everywhere we are, because we are experiencing something that seems to be like a kind of creeping loss of reality that you can feel in conversations and in kind of general mood of the period we are going through. So I thought it would be interesting to introduce an angle and to examine some works that might be abstract, or some other works that might be figurative or whatever, and to see that these categories do not matter if you look at them in terms of what Jacques Lacan termed real, and the real in Lacan, to make it to put it in a kind of brief explanation, is something that is beyond words, that is related to trauma, that appears in the moment of crisis, that is not something that can be agreed with, by all of us here, that this is real, although it might be, but it's rather, something that happens in the moment when things get broken, and then you don't know how to react, and you try to find words, but you cannot find words. And I think artists are those who try each time making the work to establish some connection, not only between their experience of reality and what they want to show in the artwork, but the artwork is always made in public sphere, and therefore, the viewer is half of the work, the visitor is half of the work. We know famously from the 1960s, declarations of several conceptual artists globally that there is a kind of importance of the artwork being a point in the conversation, connecting the sender and the receiver. And in this case, the receiver is important too. So the hope with this exhibition, What is Real, is maybe to give some provisional response to a small part of what I found in the Nobel lecture, the Nobel Prize lecture in literature in 2019, which was by a Polish writer, Olga Tokarczuk. She gave this speech in Stockholm on the occasion of receiving the Nobel Prize, and she said something like, I think we have a redefinition ahead of us of what we understand nowadays by the concept of realism, and the search for a new one that would allow us to go beyond the limits of our age and penetrate the glass screen through which we see the world, So it's like this moment in which, this third wall or Brechtian third wall and glass screen are being penetrated or perhaps broken in order to, maybe in a kind of futile effort to touch or to experience the real, if you like. And I think in many works in this exhibition that I'm working on, including, for instance, some really outstanding works of Japanese kind of anti-commodity, avant-garde performance art, late 1960s and 1970s, where there will be first kind of unauthorized performances in public space, disturbing the proverbial order of a Japanese street or public space. This sort of works, up to contemporary works that sometimes, with very modest means, try to grasp something of the complexity of the experience of a denizen of a metropolis like Tokyo, from a kind of pedestrian and very low perspective. That is something that would interest me in this exhibition. It's exactly the same thing that interested me in Documenta, with this move to kind of bringing from its home, Kassel, Germany, where it had this long tradition of past documentas. I wanted to see if Documenta can be still a tool with which to look at the reality of a place and learn something from it, and kind of, create an exhibition that is in the end a follow-up of a longer process, which was the case of Documenta 14 in Athens that preceded, the iteration of the show in Kassel in 2017.
Yeah, thank you. It's fascinating that both exhibitions have the word real in the title. I don't think that was coordinated, but obviously, I'm sure you're aware, Doryun, that in Japan, notions of capturing a real Japan or an authentic Japan have been a very potent myth, both for Japanese and international visitors alike. So I'm wondering if that was something you were also thinking about in this notion of the prism of the real.
Yeah, I think that was in the sort of background. I don't think it was in the foreground of what we were thinking. I think just the word real came up. Actually, there's quite a lot of resonance to what Adam was just saying, but perhaps a bit in a less philosophical sense. But the contradictions of really the different narratives and perceptions about that society and during a very interesting transitional period, right? Again, earlier I talked about Japan as, talking about 20 years as a lost decade. And also there is a very strong discourse within Japan of seeing how the country turned more and more inwards during that time period. So the bubble period in the 80s, the good old times with the champagne bottles popping, and then go out and buy all the Van Gogh's sunflowers that are available or whatnot, to suddenly that you enter recession and almost a psychological depression, and then the country turns inward. But in fact, when you see that it was just full of many exchanges and conversations across Japan and other surrounding regions and countries. And another thing that happens in the post-Cold War period is that Japan begins to put more emphasis on its relationships with the neighboring nations. Before that, I think that Japan was much more driven by how to almost like form prove itself to the Western world. Maybe that is also the after effects of being occupied by the Allied forces for 7 years after the end of the war. But after the 80s, it also begins to also pay more attention to the Asian neighbors. So given all of that, I thought there were many paradoxes in the dominant discourse of how Japan describes itself, how it narrates itself. So then what is the real is how the title came about, reflecting really the questions that we had in our head.
Right. I mean, Adam, you also did a very interesting project in Tirana called Tirana Patience, which was, looking at the legacy, I guess, of socialist realism or state-sponsored socialist realism in a museum context. So could you talk a bit about, that project?
I mean, rather than describing the project that you can see, I would say that, this was working with primarily sort of social realism or socialist period works in the National Gallery of Arts in Tirana that has a collection. This collection is presented in the building, and it's the works that were created mostly prior to the fall of the dictatorship that ruled Albania from, I think, 1947 to around 1990. And so this date, which is in the title of your show, 1989, is also interesting because it completely means probably something else, or slightly different, view, like inflection from my or our perspective of the, for instance, what is known as former East Europe, or which kind of remains former East Europe, including East Germany, for instance. So 1989 is this moment where, the Cold War ends and, everything seems to be possible suddenly, and people start to travel in a free way, and in Albania too. And so very late came this invitation to work on the collection of National Gallery of Arts in the year 2018, 2019. And what we proposed with the co-curator Natasha Ilic from the WHW group in Zagreb was to basically cover this entire collection with white cloth on stretchers, tailor-made to cover each painting, So the collection was there, but it disappeared. So it was kind of visible through the very, dense cloth, as sort of paintings invisible. Then we invited a number of contemporary artists who knew something about that collection and about individual artworks, and then they uncovered some of the works from the collection and added their contemporary works. So it was kind of like trying to read the existing collection without kind of recurating it through like rehanging or removing some works or bringing some other works from the storage, but taking it as a sort of huge museum ready-made, the existing collection, and trying to work with it through kind of direct intervention by contemporary artists, And I think this gesture of removal of things from view is constitutive for understanding what really exhibitions mean to us, because when we don't see things, this is exactly the moment where this tension between our desire or wish or expectation to see something in a gallery and the fact that we are, not allowed to see perhaps for a moment, or we only allowed to see a part of it, that is a very interesting tension to me, in the kind of approach to existing buildings too. And we have some ideas how to work with the Okura building as well, in that sense.
Yeah. And Doryun, your institution M+ is home to probably the world's greatest collection of Chinese contemporary art, the SIG collection. And China, of course, had many years of social realism, regime in art. I have friends who actually had to study social realism when they were at art school. So this is, 2 generations ago only. or one generation ago. So, how do you think about this sudden shift from social realism in China to Chinese contemporary art, and has that informed how you look at other countries in the region?
Yeah, I think just being positioned in Hong Kong, which is really on that threshold of mainland China and the rest of the world. I mean, we often talk of the city as the portal this way and that way. But it's important to also say that China is an enormous country, so there are, in fact, many subtle differences and many different realities, using the key term here. But I think coming from more Western or certain parts of Asian background, whether it's a Korean or a Japanese, where a lot more continuity or sort of synchronicity, I guess, with what we understand as general Western discourse. China, of course, presents a total different alternative. And you're right, socialist realism was the dominant style from 1949 when People's Republic of China was established, and until just 1 or 2 generations ago, that's what artists were trained in. And then, of course, the idea of art in the service of greater causes, right? Whether it's a people or the party or proletariat and all of that. So it's not that that disappeared immediately and replaced by contemporary Chinese art, which speaks closer language to contemporary art we know in general. These things coexisted, still coexist, and it was a really great reminder to talk to certain a bit older artists or even collectors to say that, what you might think is a kitschy, sort of kind of retrograde kind of a socialist realist style is still very important for us because that was our main visual cultural language. That's what we grew up with. And so because of what we are more familiar with as a so-called conceptual contemporary art came in, doesn't mean that that tradition disappears immediately. So yeah, I mean, I think having the most in-depth and largest collection of more conceptual Chinese contemporary art, in fact, ironically, created more appreciation of the parallel tradition that actually existed. I mean, speaking of the post-war and Cold War period, then it was 2 parallel worlds that was happening, right? And then socialist realism is often seen as anti-modern or even pre-modern, but that is a modernist style as well. It is just an alternative style.
Right.
So yeah, so we see that happening simultaneously for us.
Well, we're running out of time, so thank you both for sharing your thoughts and for giving us a sneak peek at your exhibitions. Art Week Tokyo runs this year from November 5 to November 9. Prism of the Real, Making Art in Japan, will be on view starting from September 3rd. And AWD Focus, What is Real, will be on view only for the 5 days of Art Week Tokyo. There will be many other great exhibitions on view as well. It's a great time to visit the city and see Japanese art in Japan. So we hope to see you there in November. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Dorian. Thank you again for the 3 of you for this fascinating glimpse, and that definitely is a strong temptation to see you all in Tokyo come November. We're going to take a little break and come back at 2:30 to look at an emerging art scene that you should also all be looking at in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. So see you very soon. Thank you.